Hey everybody, this week's episode is with Peter Ames Carlin. Peter is a great author and he's wrote books about Brian Wilson, Bruce Springsteen, Paul Simon, and he's an upcoming book out in January called Sonic Boom. So I had a great talk with Peter and we talked about many things and thank him for his knowledge and his time. So enjoy. Peter, how are you doing?
I'm well, thank you very much.
How's the coronavirus going for you?
Well, I haven't gotten a haircut in a while, as you might have noticed. You apparently haven't ever had a haircut.
It's seemingly gone red now, but yeah.
Yes, it's gone bright red.
Yeah.
It's I don't know. It is what it is. We suck over here because we have such a moronic president, and so they haven't developed anything like a national policy on how to deal with it.
Yeah.
And so we're all sequestered. You can't see your friends. Everybody, it's like the whole country had to, it's like the whole world had to go to its room for a while to have a timeout.
It's so strange. So, we've gone into a lockdown again.
Is that right?
Yeah, stage 3 lockdown. So it's kind of, I don't know when this is going to end. It's quite odd. It's peculiar, but
it's beyond peculiar. I mean, it's just, I didn't see it coming, I mean, the whole world has been, it's like you just think about these things that you took for granted. Like,
I know.
Oh, I can go to the corner and have a beer.
Yeah.
It's like, no, you can't.
Yeah.
I can have dinner with my friends. No, you can't.
Yeah.
So
I was living in Berlin just before it happened. And I still was kind of hopping from place to place. And I said, I'll come back to Ireland for a while, just while this thing blows over after a few weeks. And then the whole place went into lockdown. I was like, oh, God, I don't know what to do. So I was just like, I'll just chill out here for a while. And that's become a long whiler than I thought. But
I know. It's like, and now it might be a year before life goes back to normal.
I know. I see all these like bands putting on concerts and stuff. I'm like, I don't know about that, lads,
So. Yeah. I mean, the thing is, it's like, at least we're grown up. So you have some sense of so it's like the years go by, time goes by a little more quickly. But could you imagine being a little kid and not being able to go to, never being able to see your friends and not going to school? I guess not going to school would be fun, but imagine how bored you would be and what a crap summer you would have had.
Though I was quite introverted, so I would have probably had a great time for myself. Mm-hmm. It probably wouldn't have been any different, But what was I going to say? Did you write a lot of your new book during the lockdown, or had you started it previously, or
the Warner Brothers record
the Warner
book?
Brothers, yeah.
That was basically written before the COVID thing happened, but I was doing a lot of editing and a lot of work, and then and then I wrote a book proposal, and I'm started work on a new book about REM, which I'm really enjoying working on for now. And so and as a writer who works from home, I mean, my life is pretty solitary to start out with.
Yeah.
So it hasn't, in terms of work, there hasn't been that much of an adjustment.
Yeah.
It's all the same.
If you're a musician or anything like that, it's kind of like, well, I've been in quarantine all my life anyways.
Yeah. Except for the people who you can't perform anywhere. I have friends with bands and they're all suddenly marooned. It's like, what do we even do with our time?
Yeah, it's odd. It's surreal, but I don't know. I don't see anything soon, I don't think anything's going to come soon, so.
You got to figure out the vaccine business and then start poking people.
Poke the politicians first, let us be second after the politicians. That should be the rule, let those dudes get the first poke. So how I got to know you actually was from reading the Brian Wilson book you did. How long ago was that? 2011? No, 2005, 6.
Yeah, it came out in 2006.
Yeah, 2006. Yeah, such an amazing book.
Thank you very much.
Oh, it's a great book, man. It's great.
Thanks.
What was it like meeting Brian?
Look, it was really weird. I met him in 1998. And I was on a magazine assignment. I used to work at People Magazine here in the U.S. in New York, and Brian had a new record out, and I had been a fan of his for since I was a little kid, since I was 13 basically, and a real super duper Brian fan. I mean, since then, and and so, I sort of mythologized him in my head as you do.
Yeah.
And so the record was coming out. And so I pitched to my editors. It was like, hey, let me do a profile of Brian. And People magazine at the time was, I think, the biggest magazine or the most widely read magazine in the US. It may still be. But at that time, they had 40 million readers.
Wow.
And so when you spoke to, people trying to get access, it was incredibly easy.
Yeah.
Because everybody, it's not just you they're interested in, it's your 40 million friends
Yeah.
behind you and being able to get that kind of a reach. So it was really easy to get access to him. And I went and met him. He was living in Illinois at the time, the state of Illinois in the Midwest, outside Chicago, which was sort of a weird place to find him. But it was that record Imagination that had just come out. And I remember there were 2 days, and the first day was mostly going to be photographs. But I decided that I wanted to go and hang out during the photography part too, just to get a sense, just to be able to kind of watch him in action a little bit and get a sense of how he moved through the world and all this. And so they let me do that, and then he and I chatted a little bit. And it was so I got to sort of, before I really engaged with him, I got to watch a little bit. And then the next day we really sat down and talked for a few hours. And that was good. We sort of, the cool thing was that we sort of hit it off. I think, however I presented myself, that he seemed to get comfortable with me pretty quick.
Yeah.
And we had a really good conversation that first day. It's weird. But anytime that you go to, if there's like an artist or somebody that you've grown up or have sort of, who you've admired for a really long time.
Yeah.
I had a similar experience with Bruce Springsteen when I was working on that book, is that you're suddenly sort of confronted by their physical reality, which is different from the person who you've imagined that they are to some extent. And you have to and so the hard part is girding yourself for them to say or do something that completely blows it for you. Yeah. Where they say or do something, it's like they might do something horrible, and then you have to deal with that. It's like, how do you go back and listen to their work that you love when if they do something terrible?
Yeah, I get you.
To completely destroy your sense of them. So it's weird, and Brian's an odd guy. I mean, Bruce is easy to deal with because he's very socialized and he has a really good sense of what people are looking for from him when they meet him, how he should behave. Whereas Brian is sort of just flitters around wherever he's going to be, and you don't know whether he's going to be welcoming and open and able to talk, or whether he's whether he's going to be completely crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, going into it, and I don't know that he knows necessarily, but it was cool. I enjoyed the Brian that I got to know.
Yeah, I kind of, in a weird way, I wish he wouldn't play anymore. I know that sounds like an awful thing to say, but I find it hard seeing him up there. I feel bad for him. It's like, oh man, I don't know. I just feel like he's suffering sometimes.
He wouldn't be there if he didn't want to be doing it.
Really?
He loves it.
Oh, does he?
Yeah.
Because
he likes touring because it gets him out of the house, and everything's about him, and he runs everything, and his days are structured, and he knows where he's supposed to be. I don't know. He always, at some shows, he's more engaged than others.
Yeah.
And it's really horrible to be in a show with him where he's just plainly phoning it in.
Yeah. I've seen him about 4 or 5 times. I think one of those times he looked like he was definitely just not want to be there.
Yeah. It could be that he gets up there and he's just not feeling it or whatever, as you would imagine, or something. Maybe his back hurts, or maybe he's hungry, or he's just not up for it that day. And I think his psyche bounces around a little bit. Some days he's more comfortable in his own skin than in other days. But I think also now, I mean, there's sort of an inevitable frame of the faculties of his actual instrument, his voice, as he gets older. I mean, he's close to 80 years old now. And
that's crazy.
Even Paul McCartney, I saw McCartney play a little more than a year ago, and I'd seen him perform. I first saw him in 1976, and so and I've seen him a whole lot of times since then, 10, 12, it feels like, I don't know, I can't count right now. But the last time I saw him was the first time I could clearly hear fraying in his voice, age related.
He's a bit strained on his voice now. Especially on some of the songs, you can kind of hear it.
And I remember I saw him in 2015 in Seattle, and I was astounded at how strong his voice was.
Really?
As recently as that. I remember I was close to the speakers, especially close to the speakers, because I needed to go to the potty actually, and I was in line. It was on a stadium, and I was on the ground. I'd gotten good seats because of my media jackal credentials.
Yeah.
And I was up pretty close to the front, and I was close to the speakers, like where the vocals are coming out of that part of the PA, as I was online for the bathroom. And I just remembered that I could feel the vibrations of his voice, and it was really strong. And I was astounded at how powerful he was on the upper part of his range.
Right.
Which is tough to do at any age.
His band are incredible too.
The band is amazing. And it's like Brian Wilson's band. I mean, they've hooked up with these energetic young musicians who can really carry them, if they need it. And Brian, I don't think McCartney needs to be carried as much as Brian does.
No, because it's like McCartney's singing is very, he's not doing a lot of intricate falsetto and stuff like that. Like, it's Beach Boys for me. I think it's a lot more intricate wise, harmony wise. Beatles harmonies.
It's really hard to sing.
Yeah, he's doing a lot of weird kind of chords and stuff like that. Like, especially when you hear them on
melody.
Yeah.
They're just all over the place.
Yeah,
and you've got like a song like "Don't Talk, Put Your Head on My Shoulder."
Such a good song.
The Pet Sounds record. It's like, who can sing that?
I know. I know. Yeah, it's strange. Even when you play the chords of like "Till I Die" on their own, it's so weird. And then when you put the melody on top, it's so perfect. He just had this great way of like putting chords that you would never dream of putting together, and you hear that sounds odd, but once the voices come together, it's just like, oh my God. And then you don't hear it without it anymore. It's like you're just used to that.
Well, his melodies travel so easily from key to key.
Yeah.
So you get a song like, I think the real sort of astounding example is "This Whole World" from Sunflower, and that changes key like every twice a bar.
Yeah.
Or it's every 2 bars, because it's like
starts off in C, I think.
C, and it's like, so it goes from C to F to okay, so you're still in C, and then to E minor, and then up to G, so you're good, and then A minor. So you're sort of fiddling around in the key of C, but then suddenly it leaps up into the key of A, and then suddenly you're in the key of B, and then you're in the key of D flat, and you're sort of bouncing all around. And the amazing thing is that the melody travels so easily. It's like the chords are following his ability to modulate like that on a dime is astounding. McCartney writes, he's got a lot of power on the top end of his range. And so he writes a lot of really high parts, and especially, like on his rockin' song. But like, if you listen to "Maybe I'm Amazed," like that's really hard to sing if you're trying to do it in his.
Maybe I'm amazed.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's always that debate, isn't it? That Beach Boys, Beatles kind of thing. I go back and forth. Like, I listen to the Beatles and go, oh, the Beatles, and then I listen to the Beach Boys and go, oh, the Beach Boys. I think overall, the Beach Boys just. When I first heard like I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, that's when I was kind of consciously aware of the Beach Boys, if you know what I mean. I probably knew their hits of like fun and all that kind of stuff. There was a TV show, and it was like they played "I Just Wasn't Made for These Times," and they were saying this guy Brian Wilson is describing what was happening at the time. He was at home, and they were going out on tour, and I'm like, what? It was so weird, because I'm growing up going, but all bands just go on tour. It was straight. I thought it was just and then that same week it happened to be this really bad Beach Boys movie on that I loved at the time, but in retrospect, it's terrible. And then there was a biography on Brian Wilson, and then it was all at the same time. So I just got into the Beach Boys and bought Pet
Yeah.
Sounds, and I was like, whoa, like it just blew my mind. I was like, this is unbelievable.
Yeah, it's an amazing sort of story, and I've always viewed, I sort of, I'll tell you, I mean, I was born in 1963, so I was like a second generation Beach Boys fan, and so I think the first time I was really conscious of listening to the Beach Boys was when the movie American Graffiti came out in 1973. And they released the soundtrack from that, which had a whole lot of kind of 1950s, early 60s songs on it, very nostalgic. And it's interesting, in 1973, those songs were slightly more than 10 years old, and they sounded like they came from like another planet compared to, in the era after the Beatles, everything that had happened during the 60s and how youth culture had changed and music had changed. And then the next year they released this 2-record sort of greatest hits album of the early Beach Boys songs called Endless Summer. And my big brother came home with it, and we were listening to it, and the music just leaps off the vinyl. I mean, it just sounds like nothing you'd ever heard before. And so I loved that stuff. And my brother eventually just gave the record to me. And I listened to it constantly. But I had been a huge Beatle fan from the time I was 3, so they were sort of my original band. I mean, they were like my first love, But then by the time I was 13 or so, in 1976, during the Brian is Back thing, that moment where he sort of rejoined the band, and there was all this publicity about him being back and what it meant and all this, because they had such a huge hit with that Endless Summer collection in 1974. There was all this anticipation for new Beach Boys music. And I began to read about him, like this huge article in Rolling Stone and a bunch of other magazines, and you realize like what the man had been through. And there was a kind of romantic quality to his suffering, which is, he was sort of like the wounded inner child in all of us, this extremely talented, sweet-natured, fragile individual who's been beaten up by the world time and again, made to be punished for his beauty in a way.
Yeah.
And his work had climaxed with this record Smile that never came out. And so it's like, this and that had seemingly ruined him as an artist. Like it blew him up and he couldn't function after that. And it was sort of like, oh my God, it's like he's made this record that's too beautiful to exist.
Yeah.
And he's too brilliant to exist. And so, and I completely, as somebody who felt like he got beat up a lot, as a kid emotionally, like I guess everybody feels that way.
Yeah.
But it completely worked for me. I mean, I could project so much of my own experience and my own sadness and hope and ambition into Brian's story. And then you start listening, you really get deep into the music and you get a sense of how fucking brilliant it is. And as a young teenager, I didn't know why it felt so powerful to me. But there's so much going on. And then the more, the older and more sophisticated I got, I suppose, and learned more about music, then you begin to realize like this is insanely complicated stuff.
Yeah.
Everybody thinks that it's easy, that it's all simpleton, it's all fun in the sun, summer songs. But even those early songs are musically complicated in a way that's astounding, and I think emotionally complicated too, which is one thing that people don't give them credit for in those early songs. People talk about, it's all fun in the sun, but it isn't. Like those songs about surfing are about being terrified and of maybe getting killed.
Yeah.
Like I go back in I called that Brian book Catch a Wave, because it kind of summarizes, obviously that sort of evokes the early songs and all this. But my favorite thing about the actual song Catch a Wave, or the thing that I find most fascinating about it, is that the first 3 words are "Don't be afraid."
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to try the greatest sport around. And so from the get-go, they're warning you that there's something to be afraid of. Like, and then basically the message of the song is like, you can go out and have this adventure, go surfing and challenge yourself and sort of go mano a mano with Mother Nature by paddling out and turning around and raising and surfing on the astonishing energy of these waves. But on the other hand, you could get killed you could drown, you could get thrown under the rocks. I mean, and also there are these bad guys on the beach who are making fun of you, because you're a surfer. So all this power is arrayed against you, but you're still gonna, and it's like, that's complicated. Or like the love songs, the Beatles, those early Beach Boys songs, like those cute little love songs, like Help Me Rhonda. But then what's the first line of Help Me Rhonda? Since you put me down, I've been out doing in my head. Like, that's striking.
Yeah.
Or Wendy, any song, any Brian, Beach Boys song in those early days that actually mentions a woman by name is a terribly sad song. Wendy, what went wrong? We went together for so long. But when he pulls back and they become abstractions, like California Girls. Well, East Coast girls are hip. I really dig those styles they wear. It's like in the abstract, from a distance, he's completely comfortable with women. But the more intimate the relationship becomes, to the point where he knows their names, it all falls apart. There's that one beautiful song from '65, She Knows Me Too Well, maybe late '64. And they go, but the first line, what's the first line of that song? Sometimes I have a weird way of showing my love. We're just like, yoink, like, what? Like, what? Continue? What's that supposed to mean? And then he gets into it. And it's this very, very complicated, sort of painful love affair.
Yeah.
And he talks, and it's a theme that comes up again and again. I mean, even in Surfer Girl, which is such a sweet little innocent thing, but the imagery, little surfer, little one made my heart come all undone. Like, I could see how that's a good thing, but I could also see how what you're describing sounds scary. What does it mean to have your heart come undone? You're opening yourself up. You're making yourself, it's an extremely vulnerable song. The same way that Don't Worry Baby, which presents itself as a song about a car race, is, he's terrified. And a lot of people, if you really want to engage your inner Sigmund Freud, you can see the car as something more than a car. Is this a metaphor for his sexual anxiety? Because you'll notice in that song, the woman in that song is much more sexually aggressive than he is. And he talks about, what she does to me when she makes love to me, which is ordinarily, so in other words, she sounds kind of like the sexual aggressor.
Brian's into dominatrix, maybe, you never know.
Well, less that than I think you could take it that far. But I see it as just someone who is maybe that he's more reticent. He's more about being physical, about being sexual.
Yeah.
And she's the assertive one. She's initiating it, and he's not sure he can keep up.
Well, he's a shy guy. You can even see when you watch those interviews years ago. He was quite, though. I always found when he was in interviews talking about music, he was quite forthright. Like the Brian in the '60s, when you hear him talk on the radio, on those old radio casts, or when they have, video footage of him, he's very forthright and knows what he's talking about. And then when you pan to like later, it's like so different. Sometimes he'll talk a little bit and sometimes he'll talk a lot. And it's strange to actually take that guy and put him in, it's the same guy, but it's not.
Well, but it sort of depends who he's talking to also.
Right.
Or what mood he's in at the time. Because it's like, even after I had established a pretty good connection to him and had interviewed him a bunch of times, a few years passed. It was like about another 6 years went by before I started working on the book after I first met him. And I had done a couple stories magazine stories about him after that, and had spent some time with him here and there. But I began to see him more often when I was working on the book and interviewing him more often. And there were days when he was open and warm and relaxed, and we'd have great talks. And there were days when he was freaked out about something and he was like a zombie.
Right.
And so, and I think, and maybe some days I came in with different energy than I had the first time. And he closes down. But you read those articles where people interview him and they come away saying, like, he was so terrified. Like, this man is so sick. He was so miserable. Why do they make him do this? But nobody ever, but then the thing is, those writers, none of them ever wonder whether they were the problem that day.
Okay,
maybe they came in with some sort of aggro obnoxious energy that he didn't want any part of. Because there's a lot of Brian where he'll say anything just to get out of the room. I mean, really, literally, he'll just agree with you about everything, and then he'll say, like, "Are we done? Is it time to go?"
Right.
Because there's a lot of times. There's times when I've been with him where we've talked for hours, and it's been relaxed and fun. And there were times where, literally, within 5 minutes of starting to talk, he was asking if I had enough and whether he could go.
Okay.
He's a quirky guy. I mean, the way that I describe Brian is, the one sentence I came up with is that he's weirder than you can imagine, but not as crazy as you might think.
Yeah.
He uses his reputation for craziness to keep people at an arm's length and possibly to get them out of the room if he can possibly do that.
So he's quite sentient almost. He's not as much as the press let on that he's just some kooky dude.
Yeah. He's the other thing about Brian is that he may be the most successful passive aggressive person on the face of the earth.
Yeah.
Because he's very, because he is at heart a producer and a record producer, as you know, controls everything in the studio. And he was the real auteur. He wrote, arranged, and produced his stuff when he was on it. And so he made the final call on everything.
Yeah. I still love a lot of those post-Smile records. I think they're like Sunflower is up there in one of my favorite Beach Boys records.
Yeah. I mean, it's a beautiful record. I mean, even like, Wild Honey and Friends and those records that came immediately afterwards are brilliant.
Yeah.
And extremely complicated. They're just not, he's not shooting for the stars in the same way. I mean, he sort of stripped it back a little bit, but that's what everybody was doing by the end of 67, early 68. Dylan with John Wesley Harding and, a lot of people, getting a little, just stripping things down a bunch. And then the White Album, obviously, and the Beach Boys kind of led the way really with Smiley Smile in mid 67. It was, I think, John Wesley Harding came out 4, 5, 6 months after Smiley Smile did.
Do you like Smiley Smile?
In a way, yeah. I mean, at the time, yeah, it's a really weird record.
Yeah,
it's
I'm with you on that.
Bizarrely psychedelic, and it's kind of a disturbing record in the sense of
like Wind Chimes is very, very different than the Wind Chimes Smile.
Well, there's that moment in it, in the Smiley Smile version of it. It begins very spare, just with Carl singing over like Brian's organ notes. And whereas if you compare it to the Smile version, which was, are those marimbas?
Xylophone marimbas, yeah.
And, and it's more elaborate, and it's a bigger production. It's more thought through. And then you get this, but the Smiley Smile Wind Chimes, you get that part where it's like hanging down from my window to my wind chimes. But then the background vocals come in and they're really weirdly discordant.
Yeah.
And then there's that moment where the whole thing seems to collapse.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the voices come in again, sort of more in that a cappella section, the wind chimes tingling. But then they're coming down through like those dark, it's like a minor, it's like that sort of minor seventh thing where the notes feel bent and twisted. It gets kind of dark and surreal. And then it blossoms into that where they're singing together again, a cappella, but it's very made, it's all major chords and it's lovely. It's like it's like a, blossoms coming up. And so there's that, but then there's like Vegetables is really sort of off the charts strange. And there's just a lot of discord on that record.
Yeah.
It feels a little like like the remnants of a really bad acid trip.
And even Heroes and Villains on it, production wise, it just seems out of place. Like it's cool, but production wise, it's like it just doesn't fit. It fits it, but doesn't fit, if you know what I mean. It's so stylistically, production wise, different.
Well, you get it. It's a bit of a dog's breakfast, as they say, because side one begins with Heroes and Villains, which is full on Smile, basically. but then very quickly, I think the next song is Vegetables. It very quickly becomes the stripped down version.
Yeah.
But then you flip over the record and you put on side 2, and the first song on side 2 is Good Vibrations, which again is Pete Smile. I mean, that was sort of the model for Smile, the sort of modular thing of different sections sort of put together and made to flow in this uncanny way. And that's obviously in a very, very full production, as full as it ever got. But then very quickly you're back to this one organ note or acoustic guitars in the studio with the guys, and it's neat. I mean, it's sort of cool. It's especially cool now that we have the finished Smile, but because you get both, you can kind of go either direction. But for a time when Smile didn't exist and all we knew were rumors about it and little snippets of songs that had come through, like Evanescence. I mean, there were all these tantalizing glimpses of what it was supposed to be. And it shows up as this kind of, stripped down, skeletal, sort of fucked up skeletal version of it. It's like, that was really sad for a long time. It's like poor Brian. It's like this, it was almost like he was, he'd had all his finery stripped away, and here he was sort of naked and beaten up, and this is what he had, and this is what we got instead.
But I always thought, at the time, because you'd watch all those documentaries and I'd read books and all that stuff. When I got into the Beach Boys first, and then I found out I was Smile, I was like, holy, so what the fuck is this Smile thing? It's like you're going into this other world of like, this is just crazy, it's like the folklore of it and all the myths and this, and you read everything you possibly can on it because it's so interesting. But at the time, I was like, I always blamed the other Beach Boys for Smile not coming out. But now I'm not sure, because it seems like Brian, if he wanted it to come out, probably would have came out. Maybe you have more insight than I would, but that was, in hindsight, that's my kind of thought on it.
Yeah. Well, my feeling about Brian and the sort of increasing complexity of his music in the mid '60s, sort of climaxing with, Pet Sounds and then Good Vibrations, which was the first shot of Smile, what Smile was supposed to be. That his music, that there was a sort of the increasing complexity of the music was in some ways a wall that he was trying to build higher and higher and higher to keep his psychiatric dysfunction away from him, because the rest of his life was in increasing chaos.
Okay.
In part to, sort of the resistance he was getting from the other Beach Boys, particularly Mike Love, who was very, very suspicious of this kind of more psychedelic sort of hippie type stuff, largely, and the other guys would go off and perform all this music, and their experience was seeing how audiences responded to their hits and to the surfing and Cars songs. And then they'd come back to the studio with the cheers still ringing in their ears and be singing this bizarre psychedelic stuff that they couldn't even imagine doing on stage, let alone having their audience of screamers, like sit still for. And so and also Brian's behavior at the time was getting more eccentric. And they couldn't figure out to what extent that was about drugs. Like, are these weird hippies that he's working with now, are they just giving him acid nonstop? Is that what the problem is? But at the same time, he's having struggles with the record company. His dad, Murray, his very sort of bully boy dad, who was, who came from his own extremely dysfunctional past, and was beaten badly by his dad, and and these guys, and didn't really know, as much as he loved his boys. There's a real tragic element to Murray Wilson's domineering personality and the way that he sort of simultaneously, he mortgaged his business so that they could get their start as a band.
Yeah,
which is a huge thing. But on the other, so he gave them their career on the one hand, but on the other hand, he kept trying to yank it back.
Yeah. Do you think he was jealous of Brian?
Yeah, he was extraordinarily jealous of Brian because he'd wanted to be a songwriter too. And, you know, I mean, he had his talent and, you know, and he understood music and all this stuff. And he did pretty well, got some songs published and covered, you know, by like Lawrence Welk, you know, I mean, the band of the day. Yeah. But then he gave birth to this son, you know, who was a genius,
Yeah.
basically, whose gifts outstripped his by so much it wasn't even funny.
I know.
And how do you deal with that? I think a lot of guys, a lot of dads, you know, especially dads who are like who are public figures, are have a really hard time with when their children begin to kind of outstrip them a little bit. You know, because you see that sort of there's like a kind of jealousy built in. You know, and Murray had it bad.
It's unfortunate.
Very unfortunate. And so my sense of the increasing complexity is that Brian was trying to keep all that craziness out in the one, you know, out of away from himself. And the only place where he really could control everything was in the recording studio. And so threw everything he had into the recording studio. But then when the bad vibes got into the studio, you know, and to some extent because, you know, Mike was having was really questioning the lyrics that Van Dyke Parks wrote and really questioning Brian's direction. And I think the other guys had their doubts too. And then Capitol Records was upset with him, and then it turned out that they had been stealing money from the band. And so the band got into this terrible lawsuit with them, and all this shit finally gets into the studio, at which point Brian, you know, and that's like a good 80% of the way through recording Smile. And then he just can't take it anymore. And he has to step away. And so Brian was the one who pulled the ripcord and said, okay, screw it, I'm not doing this anymore. But so he could have brought it to fruition, but he just didn't have it in him anymore. I think he was, you know, his organic dysfunction was overcoming him. And that's at the point, if you study, you know, psychosis and people with schizophrenia or whatever, you know, those symptoms tend to really present themselves when you're in your early to mid 20s, which is exactly where Brian was.
Yeah. It's a shame though, because I always wonder what had happened if Smile came out. Like maybe it mightn't have been the big punt everyone thought it was going to be. It could have just, you know, vanished, or it could have been huge, or what ifs in life or everything. But you know, it's
right.
It's always I always wonder how it would have changed the landscape of music, because music back then had way more impact than it does now. You know, people, you know, I just know it from reading in hindsight and stuff like that, you know, like people, when an album came out, it was an event. You know, when an album comes out now, it's like, oh, you have an album out. It doesn't have that same thing. I personally don't think. Like, I remember when I was a kid going to shops and getting a CD, it was like, you know, I'd be waiting for ages going, oh my God, the CD's coming out. You know, now it's almost like fast food, and it just doesn't, I don't think it has an effect. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe 16-year-olds and stuff like that, they see it more than I do, but it just had a bigger effect on culture than it does now, I think.
Well, back in those days, especially in the days of the sort of the blossoming of the youth culture and the baby boom sort of coming of age, suddenly you had this massive generation full of people who were going to have a huge impact on the world. And they were certainly at that point seeing, you know, culturally the sense of the counterculture and this idea of them seeing everything completely differently from their parents. Because their parents had done, you know, had lived through World War II, had fought World War II to a great degree, or experienced it and had to suffer through it, and the Great Depression before that. And they had built this enormous, powerful middle class in the 50s. And what they were looking for, because their youth had been dominated by chaos, you know, economic catastrophe, and then World War. You know, by the time the World War was done, you know, mid to late 40s, and they're settling down, you know, the common dream was get a nice house, in the suburbs, get a few kids, send them to school, everything's going to be clean and normal, and and there's going to be consistency. We're going to be able to trust in we're going to establish something and be able to trust it, these institutions, and we're not going to question them. We're not going to fuck around with this. It's like we've done enough fucking around. Like, it was horrible, and now all we want is for things to be stable. And that's and they had kids and they provided for the kids, and obviously some families have trouble and some parents are more understanding than others. But then when the kids began to rise up and turn around and say, "Well, thanks for giving us this," this very stable and wealthy society where we're all having the opportunity to be educated, far more than any previous generation, where we have more money than any previous generation, and we're healthier than any previous generation. Thanks a lot for this, and now go fuck yourselves, because everything you've done is wrong, which is. And like they had a point. I mean, there were a lot of institutional troubles that we still confront and aren't resolved today, like racism, say, economic injustice. I mean, these are ongoing problems. Sexism. I mean, there was a lot of, just institutionalized misogyny. I mean, brutal, horrible things. I mean, life was great if you were a white male, high five, but if you weren't, you started out, there wasn't an even playing field, and it still isn't. And at that time, I mean, the kids were all about like, yeah, man, we're going to change everything. We're going to have a better world, and yes, it was needed to a degree, and they had a lot of excellent points, but that struggle between the generations created the sense of these kids who were rock stars were not only celebrities and musicians and and able and good artists, but they also seem to have some great philosophical insight into life and how to live it. And so you see, in those interviews at the time, they're saying, well, what's your position on the war? Like, what do you think about the war? And they talk to them and they quote them, and and then the news, the people would, the editorialists would write about it, and people, the serious thinkers, the intellectuals, were taking into account what Lennon and McCartney had to say, not just in the music, but, or Paul Simon or Dylan. I mean, particularly Dylan, spokesman for his generation, and it's like, yeah, that's, I mean, he's also a speed-addled rock star, I mean, he's brilliant. He's a genius. I mean, Dylan is clearly, an immensely powerful thinker. But he didn't want to be a spokesman, except to the extent that he sort of did.
Yeah.
And, going up to Mick Jagger, like, what do you think about economic policy? And he's got opinions. And they're like writing it down, like, wow, okay. But whereas now, I mean, nobody, I mean, to an extent, I mean, any famous person has a certain amount of throw weight as a spokesperson for something because they have a big audience. But at the time, I mean, there was a sense that they were oracles, which is you don't get now, I mean.
And they're so but famous people are so PR orientated now,
Yeah.
You kind of get the impression, are you saying this because you believe it? Or are you saying this because it's going to get you clout in media, or you know what I mean? It's very, there's something just too PR'd about famous people now. And I think people have seen through that,
Well,
you've too much contact with them.
It's interesting the way that things have changed. I mean, in the early days, like, you can go on YouTube and find like commercials, like the Rolling Stones did a cornflakes commercial or something. I mean, they like literally did.
Check that out.
And that's like on YouTube. And like the Beach Boys would do commercials for Hondas and things like that, and write little songs and everything. And all these bands did that stuff. And it really wasn't till the Beatles came around where, and that sort of moment where the idea of the pure artist became, a thing where, you're not gonna do commercial stuff. And commerciality became a bad word, and so you see, especially, from the mid 60s forward, and, the hip pose was that you were never going to do anything to to be commercial, to have a hit, or to, especially to, to be too commercialized, to
Yeah.
be merchandised.
Yeah.
That was a very, very unhip thing. Whereas now it's almost like they should give Grammy awards, for like the best rollout of a product, because it's like Taylor Swift or somebody has a new record, but guess what? They're also doing Cadillac commercials, and
Yeah.
there's a new fragrance that's coming out at the same time. And all of these things promote one another. And, and in a way, it's sort of like, well, that sucks. But on another level, it's like, well, where else are you going to get airplay?
I know.
Because, guys like, you get like your older artists, like Dylan, for instance, when he did a Cadillac ad, and I remember Sting did an ad for Mercedes or something. But that's the way, what they do is if they peg it to the new work. And so the way that you start to get a glimpse at what their new, you begin to get of what the new music sounds like is because you see it on a commercial. Because they ain't going to play it on the radio.
Yeah. And like Zeppelin, remember Zeppelin used to wouldn't allow their songs in TV or movies. And I think I've heard Zeppelin in nearly every movie in the past few years just because of royalties. They're not making money from sales. So they're like, fuck it, we need to do something. It's not as frowned upon.
But I think that getting the music into movies and you license that stuff, I think that, yeah, you get a certain amount of money for the license, and sometimes it's a lot. But also what you're doing is you're planting that music into a new generation of ears.
Yeah.
And then those kids are like, what was that song, man? The one about the stairway. And it's like, well, check out, like, it's these guys. And they're like,
at the start of tour, it was either tour 2 or tour 3. The Immigrant Song was at the start of it, and it's just like, if you're a kid, a younger person, you heard that, you're like, what the fuck is that? That's cool, man. Like ding ding ding. So you can see the appeal.
It's like, it's suddenly, the weird thing is that the cultural wheel, now it's like, I was talking a little earlier about hearing the Beach Boys in 1974. I was 11 years old, and my first experience of music was listening to Rubber Soul and Revolver.
That's so cool, man.
My parents had those records, and I was like a toddler. And so, but then there was the Monkees too, and but they had a lot of hip records and everything. So I kind of was and I had an older brother, and so he was involved with listening to the radio and everything. And so the stuff you heard on the AM radio in those days is like kind of fantastic. I mean,
yeah,
I remember when you're hearing like Simon and Garfunkel have hit singles. I remember when Mrs. Robinson was like the hit of the summer in 1968.
Yeah,
sitting in my backyard, and somebody was painting a house behind us, and the young house painters were listening to AM radio all day. And so I would hear like, Mrs. Robinson and Hey Jude and
that's cool.
Even just like the Rascals and stuff. Like those are great songs, and it came right. It was omnipresent.
Yeah, yeah.
Whereas now it's like, everything is so fragmented because you can microcast on the internet.
Yeah, the problem is, I think a lot of music, it sounds so similar. Like the hi-hat sounds the same, the snare sounds the same, like everything. It's like the melodies are like these two-tone melodies. The chords are always the same, C, G, A, F, or just a example. But there's no complexity in it whatsoever. I love the production of new music, but a lot of music I just find very derivative. Not all of it. I mean chart music. I don't mean actually new music. But years ago, there was always chart music that I found kind of interesting. I'd always find something I go, well, that's kind of cool, or that's kind of cool. But all of it nowadays, chart music, sorry, I should say, it's very just, Billie Eilish, I think, is quite talented. I think she's doing something interesting. It's different. It's interesting. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff I find, no.
But it's the same as it ever was. I remember during the 70s, listening to music and just this accepted sense that the 70s, in the 70s even, like the 70s just fucking sucks. It's like music sucks. It's not the 60s anymore. There's no Jefferson Airplane. There's no Beatles. There's no all this hip music isn't happening. It's like It's like, and you turn on the radio and it's awful, right? Except wait a minute. Then the 70s end and you look back and you go like, oh, golly, Bruce Springsteen made fantastic record after fantastic record during the 70s. The Stones, Exile on Main Street, Sticky Fingers, like those are 70s records. Some Girls, 1970s. There's all this great music happening. Paul Simon had this incredible solo career in the 70s that had nearly nothing to do with Simon and Garfunkel and nothing to do with the stuff he was going to do in the 80s. And there's tons of great. So the thing is, at any given time, in any given genre, in any given anything, at least 90% of it sucks. Right?
That's true.
There's tons of it. So then when you look back, all you remember is the 10% of it that was good to fantastic.
I think we're more aware of it now, though, as well, because we can listen to music anytime we want on any device we want. And it's almost like water now compared to, if you wanted to listen to a song, if some band had a song you knew it was going to be on the radio, you'd wait up to listen to it or something like that. Whereas everything's so instant now, it's like almost like we have ADHD with music, Like I've seen people not listen to a full song. So just switch and switch and switch.
The point I was trying to make earlier, and then I went off on a tangent, was that
okay, I do that.
But when American Graffiti and The Summer came out, like I was listening to Beach Boys songs that were maybe 10 years old, maybe. Some of them were less than that. And it sounded like it came from another planet. Whereas if you listen to a song now from 2010, it's like, how do you know whether it wasn't released yesterday?
Yeah.
Unless it's not like there's it's not like your ear will instantly pick up on something when you put on a pop song. Like, that'll make you say like, oh, well, this is a new song versus like, wow, I can't believe how rickety and weird music in 2010 sounds.
Yeah.
Like,
do you think that's because everything's been done? Do you not think everything's not everything's been done, because you shouldn't say that, but like everything has moved in such a, like 60s music compared to 70s music. 70s music was a lot, we'd say, heavier from production wise and everything. It just, and then 80s was more electronic, so they're kind of going to stick out more than we'll say something from 2010 as opposed to like. But I get your point. There's not a huge difference between something in this 2010, something in 2020, as opposed to 1965 and 1975. It's massive.
Yeah, right.
It's massive.
Yeah, it's huge, and a lot of it may have to do with sort of the innocence and the sort of simple nature of the music from the early 60s and the mid 60s, until Dylan and the Beatles and Beach Boys and everybody kind of pushed things into a more complex arena. But the audience was younger. They were teeny boppers, and the one thing about the book I just wrote about Warner Brothers Records, the revelation that Mo Austin and Joe Smith and those guys had in the mid 60s was that the audience, the teeny boppers, because everybody, all the people sort of in the music institution just assumed that when the baby boomers grew out of their teeny bopper phase and out of their rock, and they would get through rock and roll and then realize that jazz and big band was the sophisticated music and that they were going to go back to Sinatra.
Okay.
But what Mo Austin and those guys figured out is they ain't going back to Sinatra. They're just going to want to have more sophisticated rock and roll music. Right. And so that's why they, in 1967, in 68, they go off and sign people like Neil Young and Joni Mitchell and Van Dyke Parks and some of these, Randy Newman. I mean, people, like these people who could write, songs that played like literature, or songs that were just far more emotionally and intellectually complicated. Because, what was going to, because they were right. What happened was these kids all went to college or got older and more sophisticated and got a more sophisticated sense of culture. But that didn't mean they didn't want to listen to rock and roll anymore. They just wanted to listen to music by people who could keep, who kept up with them or led the way.
Did Mo start in Verve Records?
Yeah, it wasn't called Verve. It was called Clef in the early days.
Right. I never knew that.
Because he grew up next door to the family of Norman Granz
Okay.
in Los Angeles, and he was the guy who started the jazz at the Philharmonic. He was a huge jazz fan in the '40s, and he started jazz at the Philharmonic concerts in L.A. and then spun that into this jazz record label. And he sort of built this model of a kind of a niche, record label. So he signed all the best musicians that he could find, like the jazz artists, and some of them were popular, and some of them were just fantastic.
Yeah.
And he knew that he could make these records with them, and in a way where even if they only sold like 20,000 copies, he was going to make money because he didn't have to do broad marketing. He just needed to market it to the niche.
Yeah. And there wasn't a lot of jazz guys that do, that they weren't doing massive takes and huge overdubs and stuff like that. The productions of pop songs, especially with say like Beach Boys and stuff like that, they're quite broad compared to a jazz band,
Yeah. Well, back in those days, I mean, you could record an album in a day.
Yeah.
I mean, or 2 days or whatever. You could knock out 2 tracks. You could come into the studio and knock out 2 or 3 tracks before lunch.
Yeah.
Because they weren't very, because the songs were written, everybody and probably they had lead sheets for everything, and the band would come in and play what they were supposed to play.
Yeah.
And it wasn't too hard, and you just bang it out. Or, even if it's a jazz band, it's like, these guys are great musicians. Everything's written down. Let's go. And, and they can sight read it.
Yeah.
In the big days of like the studio musicians and stuff, the guys in New York and in LA, they come in, those guys in what became known as the Wrecking Crew, Hal Blaine and,
Carol Kay.
All those guys, Tommy Tedesco and Carol Kay and Glenn Campbell, and they're just super pros. They just pack up their instruments and off they go. And 1 minute they're recording a Ford commercial, the next, and then an hour later they're doing a bird song, they're doing, and then 2 hours after that, they're recording like a soundtrack.
Yeah, it's great working with people like that are like I've sometimes I've orchestra work that I've wrote, and you get an orchestra to play it. They can just it's just so effortless for them. It's like they could read like fly shit. They're so good at it. It's like, yeah, we're done.
Yeah,
that's it.
Exactly.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And it's I think we've lost a bit of that with studios closing down, that you tend to musicians tend to learn a lot more production wise and do a lot more stuff one by one, and you kind of lose that thing of everyone playing together. Like that's what I love about those old Beach Boys records. Like rather than if they were made today, they just have that sound, there's things bleeding into each other, and there's you can feel it more than like I love some of those new Brian records like Smile. I like it, but it sounds different than the Smile of the Beach Boys. Obviously it's years later, but it doesn't have that kind of whimsically Americana kind of sound. If you know what I mean, that kind of.
I think also capturing it in its when it's still in its birthing process, where it was very immediate, where the song didn't exist 3 days ago, and then they wrote it, and then he brings it in and he shows everyone what the chords are and explains the feel of it, and everyone is inventing it as they go along. There's a freshness to that by the time Brian's band, and they're a great band, and they play really well on that record, but they're still by and large playing things that had been invented 4 decades earlier. And also in a studio where it's much more possible, where you have more than 8 tracks, where you have like 800 tracks if you need them.
Yeah.
And therefore everything, and you have Pro Tools and you have all these other things, and you can just, surgically remove certain notes and, or something, nothing's going to bleed, and it creates a different sort of more airtight sound.
I could imagine if Brian Wilson was back then and now with Pro Tools, I don't think he'd have much records out, because the minutiae of what you can do now is so more vaster, and you almost lose that instability of it, or instantaneous part of it, because you just you almost overproduce, and you lose that thing of it.
I think instability was actually a good word for
Yeah,
it,
okay.
because
We'll take that.
I understand you misspoke, but it was an artful misspeaking, because part of that is what makes it sound exciting.
Yeah.
When guys, when it's sort of, they're trying to hold it together, and everyone is sort of inventing their parts as they go along, or trying to figure out how it's going to work together. One of my favorite stories about Springsteen, work about people who, from his band, is that often he would, and he would write so many songs, and he would come into the studio to work on a record, and not only come in with dozens of songs, but be writing dozens more songs,
Right.
because it was just flooding through him at the time. And what he would do is that he would come in with a song, he would tell him what key it was in, and then just say, and sometimes he wouldn't even play the whole song to him. He would sample it a little bit and just say, and show him sort of what the feel was and what the basic outline of it was.
Yeah.
Maybe not even play through the whole thing and say, just follow me. and then he said that often the earlier takes were better before everyone knew their parts, because once they knew how the song went, they would all be trying to come up with way more complicated things to play. And he wanted the simple stuff.
Yeah.
There's that great scene. There's a documentary with him making I think the Woody Guthrie record with the Seeger Sessions band.
It's cool, right?
And they're coming up with an intro for something, and there's a guy playing the fiddle, I think, and some guy playing, and the fiddle guy is developing his part, because he's like a lead part in the intro. And he gets to a thing, and Bruce is like, okay, that's good. He goes, do it he goes, don't work on it anymore. He goes, if it was any better, it'll be worse.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you want that. It's like, I like a lot of, I like all kinds of different music, but something like the band, like the Replacements, where you can do amp buzzing while they're coming in,
Yeah.
I mean, to me, there's something really artful in it. It's like, there's a power to that.
Yeah.
Because it's like, this all could fly apart at any minute. Like, can you even, it's like trying to drive a truck down a mountain road with no brakes. It's kind of exciting. Can you stay on the road? Like, are you going to be able to hold this whole thing together while you're roaring down the, traveling a mile a minute, completely out of control? Can this thing stay together? And when it does, it's a thrill.
Yeah, I remember actually when I got into Springsteen, I never liked Bruce Springsteen. I think he kind of, my ideas Bruce Springsteen when I was, I was listening to like Bowie and the Beach Boys and Beatles and rock music and whatever, classical music and jazz. My idea of Bruce Springsteen was like that kind of like guy in a pair of jeans and the American flag kind of thing. I was like, it's a bit hokey. And then when I was in Poland, I was living in Poland at the time with a girl, and I happened to go into a shop, and it had Darkness on the Edge of Town. I said, I think I'll get this on CD. And I was like, oh my God. It's like, this is it was so different than what I thought Springsteen was. And that's my favorite album of his. I just think it's such a brilliant, like sitting in the snow, listening to that record. I was like, this is quality, man. It's such a great record.
Right. That was the one I came in on. I remember Darkness on the Edge of Town and the Rolling Stones' Some Girls, which were both released on the same day. And I went down to the record store, like after school, I went down and I bought both those, like on the same day, I bought Some Girls and Darkness.
Oh, cool.
And that was a good day at the record store. And of course, back in those days, you could buy 2 albums like that for less than $10.
Oh, whoa. That's pretty cool.
It was like, I think the list price at the time was like, I think by that time you probably had to pay, like, just given like what the stores would discount records, you could buy a brand new album for $4.98, $4.98.
Wow.
And so throw down a $10 bill and you come home with 4 cents. I mean, except for sales tax. But
you look younger. I thought you were in your 40s, man.
No, I'm 57.
Shit, man, you do not look 57.
Well, thanks.
Seriously.
But I feel every minute of it.
I thought you were about 45.
What am I going to say? Thank you very much.
No,
I don't know. Yeah, well, also you're seeing me through a computer video hookup. So, just say the pixels take off 10 years. But but yeah, no, Springsteen. I mean, the thing is, I can understand why people would resist. I mean, sort of like the cartoon image of Bruce, or like the broad brush
Yeah.
vision of Bruce. Easy to misinterpret it because people, in a lot of ways, willfully misinterpret it. It's like even now, at Donald Trump rallies, they play "Born in the USA," which is like, or like Ronald Reagan tried to claim that in the 80s as a patriotic song. It's like, ain't nothing patriotic about that song. That's like the most seditious pop song to ever hit the top 10.
Yeah.
It's basically, I mean, it is a brutal portrait of a completely, unjust America.
Yeah.
I mean, any song that begins, "Born in a dead man's town, the first kick I took is when I hit the ground." It's like, ooh, that doesn't sound like a patriotic song to me.
Well, it was always cringy to, on the other hand, seeing the Beach Boys in the 80s looking like they came from a golf course playing. And I was like, when I see those videos, I'm like, oh my God, man. I just want
it's painful.
Sick when I see them, like, especially Mike Love. It's like, oh, dude, come on, bro.
Yeah, he's a smarmy guy. Yeah, but especially when it came to trying to claim like the Reagans, because Reagan had been the governor of California and everything. But it's like, but Brian, I think is always, to the extent that he engages in politics, he's always been very progressive.
Yeah, yeah.
There's video of him performing with them in 1988, and he's wearing a T-shirt supporting, Mike Dukakis, who was the liberal Democratic, opposition to the first George Bush in 1988, and he lost. Right. But Brian has always been. I mean, I don't know that I doubt that he's had a serious political thought in his life.
Yeah, I was thinking that myself.
But his work, I mean, and definitely Smile is a very, it's the story of America to a great extent, and Manifest Destiny. Mm. And there's a lot of beauty in it, but there's also a lot of horror in that too. Mm. What you've done to the Church of the American Indian, all that business.
Yeah.
People got thrown under the wheels of those trains.
Yeah. Yeah.
The people who had to build the railways, and the people, and so there's a lot of, and that's part of telling that story was a large part of what they were trying to do with Smile. I mean, definitely that was Van Dyke Parks' idea.
Did you interview Van Dyke for the Warner Brothers book?
You know what? It's interesting. I've been friends with Van Dyke, and he's been a really sweet and cooperative, lovely person. But he absolutely did not want to talk about Warner Brothers records. He came away from that feeling as if he had been sort of done badly by Mo Austin and those guys.
Oh, okay.
Which, to some extent he has a point, but to some extent he may be also being a little more, there's a lot about Van Dyke that's very anti-institutionalist and a little, he's a very sensitive young man. And he makes there's a part of him that makes a lot of decisions that are purposefully non-commercial, where he purposely moves away from success, but then he'll turn around and be kind of crabby that he's not more successful.
I've emailed him a few times over the years, just saying, hey man, I emailed him when the Love and Mercy movie came out. And I don't think he was too happy about the cello part.
He's a paradoxical fellow. On the one hand, he didn't ever want to talk to me about Warner Brothers. And when I did sort of manage to squeeze a little bit out of him off the record, he was very, very cranky about it and would get angry at me if I said things that were too positive about Mo and Lenny and those guys. But then on the other hand, I was quoting from some of the songs in the book. And I was trying to figure out how he would feel about the lyrics being reprinted. And he instantly was like, oh, of course you can reprint them for free. Absolutely. Like, let me write you an email right now and make sure you have this for the lawyers in case they question them.
Yeah. He's a fascinating guy, though. He's a
brilliant guy.
Yeah, he's a genius too,
in his way. Yeah, very much. I mean, he's extraordinarily intelligent.
Yeah.
And an extraordinarily brilliant songwriter and arranger and
he's very articulate.
Extremely beyond articulate.
Yeah.
But sometimes, I mean, so articulate that you can't understand half of what he's saying.
I know. And when is the Warner Brothers book coming out?
It's coming out in January.
Oh, cool, cool. And is it like can you pre-order on Amazon and all the usual haunts?
You absolutely can pre-order it on Amazon. It's called Sonic Boom.
You go into the whole Reprise thing and everything like that, yeah?
Yeah. The whole sort of, because Warner and Reprise were became the same label essentially.
Yeah.
And then Madonna gets into it because Sire Records was a subsidiary of Warner from the 70s on, 77 or so.
Okay, I'm definitely gonna get that. Actually, before I let you go, I meant to tell you the story about that Lucky Old Son. I went to that Lucky Old Son premiere in London, and you know the Royal Festival Hall, all those kind of boxes. Anyways, me and my friend, we went to we snuck over to one of those boxes because we were in the cheap seats, and we're like, let's kind of slide over to here, see can we get in, because there's no one in. Anyways, we got in, we're dancing to all the songs, and we're outside afterwards, and this woman comes running over to us. And we're like, well, who's this chick? And she starts talking. She's, were you the guys dancing? We're like, yeah. And then the two band members from Brian Wilson's band, who I won't say their names, but come running over because one of them's married to her. And they thinks we're hitting on his wife. We're like, no, man, we're just, whatever. And she's like, do you want to come to the second night? We'll put you on the guest list and all this stuff. We're like, yeah, sure. Like, we didn't have anywhere to stay, so we were kind of like screwed because we couldn't stay anyways. But one of the band members tells us a story about Brian. You might have heard it at the Ivan Novello Awards with Bono. And Bono comes up to Brian and he starts doing all this, I'm not worthy stuff. Brian didn't have a clue who he was. He goes, yeah, can you get me a Coke? Thought he was working there. And the Bono came back with the Coke.
Well played, Bono.
Yeah, that's my Beach Boys, slight Beach Boys story that I have. I'm sure you got way more than I do, but that's my one and only one.
That's a good one. It's sweet that they were... when we're done this, you have to tell me who the Beach Boy band member was who thought you were hitting on his wife. I
will. I better not say it.
Guys, I mean, my experience with them has generally been really, really good. So like, hey, everyone has,
Once he realized we weren't, he was like, okay, cool. Because I was like, dude, we're not these crazy dudes in the Hawaiian shirts. Don't worry, that follow Brian around. We're quite cool, bro. So it was cool. It was cool. But anyways, man, I better let you go. I've taken up so much of your time. So I so appreciate it, man. It's really cool to talk to you. And your book is out in January, called Sonic Boom.
Yep.
And you can get it from Amazon,
wherever books are virtually sold.
Right. It's going to be in hardback, Kindle, audiobook. No audiobook.
No, I think there is going to be an audiobook.
Oh, cool. Are you going to do it?
No, somebody else is doing it. So they get actors and voice people, people who can really do a good job on it.
Yeah, I'd say you could do it yourself though. Good, no?
Yeah, maybe, I don't know. But
it takes up a lot of time.
Why? I'd just be a pain in the ass to them. It's like, why work with this clownish author if you can get an actor who's going to come in and knock it out in a few days?
Yeah,
I mispronounce words or muffle things. I got to read the intro to the foreword to the Springsteen book and the acknowledgments in the back. They let me do that for the audiobook just because I happened to be in New York.
Oh, that's cool. Anyways, man, I so appreciate this. It's been
my
awesome
pleasure.
Talking to you, man. If you want to come back when the book is out, that'd be class. Just talk about that. Be great.
Absolutely.
If you're cool with that, man. Oh, that's brilliant, man. It's been real.
Thank you for thinking of me. This has been great fun, and I'll be happy to like when the Warner book comes out or anything.
That'd be excellent, man. That'd be excellent. I'm gonna pre-order that for
there
sure,
we go.
Man. I'll spread the word, brother.
There we are. Hey, Paul, thanks a lot, man.
You too, man.
We'll be in touch, okay?
Great, man. Have a great week.
You too. Bye-bye.
Cheers, brother. Bye.